In this lesson, we'll discuss the deployment considerations that you'll need to consider before you install Security Gateway. This will include where Security Gateway will be installed. For example, will you be installing it on its own dedicated server, or will you install it on the mail server itself? How accounts will be added, such as will they be added manually, or will they be added automatically by querying Active Directory or an LDAP data source or another database. We'll also talk about changes that will need to be made to your DNS records so that mail gets routed properly through Security Gateway from external senders, and configuring your mail server to send all outbound mail through Security Gateway. So, some of the things that you'll need to think about ahead of time when deploying Security Gateway is, number one, where will it be installed? You can install it on its own dedicated server, which is the easiest scenario, or you can install it on the mail server itself. But if you install it on the mail server, you'll need to think about changing port designations and things like that so you do not have a port conflict. Also, you'll need to think about how accounts will be added. The most common scenario is accounts are added automatically by querying the mail server that Security Gateway is protecting, or an Active Directory database or an LDAP database. You can, however, manually add accounts if you would prefer to do it that way. And also, you'll need to update your DNS records when deploying Security Gateway so that mail that is being sent to the domain that Security Gateway is protecting is sent to the right server. So update your MX records, your PTR records, A records, and so forth. And that will allow mail to be routed to the Security Gateway server. That step takes care of the inbound mail. Now for outbound mail, you would also need to configure your mail server to send all outbound mail through Security Gateway. So you would basically have the mail server use Security Gateway as a smart host. So ideally, mail comes in to, let's say for example for an on-premise deployment, mail comes into your network through your router, and your router, on port 25, your router sends it on to Security Gateway, and then Security Gateway filters the messages and then sends them on to the mail server that is being protected. So in an ideal situation, Security Gateway is installed on its own server, on its own piece of hardware, separate from the mail server. And when you have a setup like this, everything can take place on port 25. So mail comes into your network on port 25 through your router, sent to Security Gateway on port 25. Security Gateway, being on its own dedicated server, will scan the messages, clean them, and then filter out any junk, and then send the remaining messages onto the mail server, all on port 25. But it is possible to install Security Gateway on the mail server itself. But when you do it this way, you'll have to think ahead about what port you want to run Security Gateway on. So in an ideal situation, mail arrives into your network on port 25 and reaches Security Gateway on port 25. And then in this situation, in the example I'm showing here, because they're installed on the same machine, the mail server is configured to use port 26 as the SMTP port. Now when you configure it that way, your users will need to make sure that their mail clients are configured to use port 26 instead of port 25 for SMTP. But that is the most straightforward approach for installing them on the same server. And that also applies to outbound mail. So your mail server, in this case, would be, for example, let's say an Exchange server running on port 26 on the same server that Security Gateway is on. Well, you would configure a smart host in the mail server to send all mail to that smart host. But in this case, that smart host is really localhost, basically, or the host name of the local machine. But instead, you'll specify port 25. So the mail server is, in essence, sending mail to the same machine, but it's sending it to port 25 instead, and then it gets sent out through Security Gateway on port 25. Another way to configure it that is less common is if you configure the settings on your router to translate the port. So everything arrives on port 25 on your router, and instead of listening in on port 25, you have Security Gateway configured to listen in on port 26 for SMTP traffic.
So the router is configured to take those connections that came in on port 25 and send them on to the Security Gateway server on port 26. Security Gateway then scans the messages and then sends them basically to localhost again to the same server, but this time on port 25. That scenario allows your users to not have to change their mail clients to listen in on port 26, but it's not as straightforward as setting it up the other way where Security Gateway is listening in on port 25. And likewise, you'll want to configure it for outbound as well. So again, your mail server would be sending basically to localhost in this scenario, except localhost, of course, that being Security Gateway, because it will be installed on the same server as the mail server. But the mail server is sending to localhost or to basically to its own to the same machine as a smart host, but on port 26. Security Gateway then sends the mail out using port 26, and your router would be configured to convert that traffic to port 25 and then send it out that way. So different ways to configure it, but the most straightforward way is to have Security Gateway listening in on port 25 and then have your mail server on port 26 and then have the clients configured to send mail on port 26 accordingly.